Today's daf we're going to be learning is about Zarah Daf Nun Gimel. We started with the Mishnah yesterday, and we saw there was a version that our Mishnah had, and then there was an earlier version that Rebbe had taught his son. And then we said that in the earlier version that Rebbe taught his son, he said, "Ovei kochavim mevatel avodah zarah shelo v'shel Israel." That a Gentile could actually, an idol worshiper, could nullify his own avodah zarah and a Jew's. To which we said, how could he nullify a Jew's? Didn't we say a Jew has to be buried? To which Rabbi Hillel answered, the son of Rabbi Valos, he answered, it's talking about when they're partners. And originally, Rabbi thought that when they're partners, the Jew is only worshiping the idol for the sake of the Gentiles. So when the idol worshiper nullifies the Avodah Zarah, then it's nullified for the Jew as well. And that was what Rabbi changed when he got older. Now we're going to have a different version. Some people take this statement that Rabbi Hillel said and said that it was actually talking about the next line in the Mishnah, which is Yisrael eino mevatelim at the very bottom of Nun Bet Amud Bet. Yisrael eino mevatel avodah zarah shel ovei kochavim. A Jew can't nullify the avodah zarah of a Gentile. So the Gemara says, Pshita. Of course, that you can't nullify an avodah zarah of an idol. How could an idol worshiper who's Gentile? How could he possibly? How would you think that a Jew could do that kind of thing? And to that, Amar bi Hillel b'rei de Rabbi Volas, lo nitzracha ela sheyesh lo bashutafut. We're talking about as if a Jew and Gentile are partners in an idol. V'kamash v'lan Yisraelu de lo mevatel lovei kochavim. Aval lovei kochavim did nafshe mevatel. What it means is that the Jew, since the Jew can't nullify the Jew's own portion, because the Jew can't nullify avodah zarah that belongs to them, they also can't nullify the Gentiles. So if a Jew decides, I'm not going to worship this idol anymore, it still has the Jew's part is still problematic, and so is the Gentiles' part. The idol worshiper that the Jew is doing it with is also considered the idol is still forbidden to benefit from for anybody. Now we have a third. Okay, so now we're going to have but sorry, I forgot to do the last line. But in Ovei Kochavim de Nafshe Mevata, if the idol worshiper, not the Jew, but the non-Jewish idol worshiper, decides to nullify their part of the idol, they can. They can't nullify the Jew's part, they can nullify their own. But if the Jew nullifies it, the Jew can't have effect on the Gentile's part. A third version of this Rabbi Hillel and what he said it on. Some people say it was on the following Braita. Rabbi Shimon ben Menashe Omer, Avodah Zarah shel Yisrael ein la betela olamit. We learned this already, right? The Avodah Zarah of a Jew has no way to ever be canceled. My olamit, what does this mean? Amar Rabbi Hillel b'rei de Rabbi Valos lo nitzcha ela sheyesh lo lovei kochavim bashutafut. V'kamash malan Yisrael adata de nafshe palach. What he was trying to teach you is, what does it mean, olamit? It means if the Jew has a partnership with the Gentile, then the Israel adate de nafshe palach. There, we assume the Jew is worshiping the Avodah Zarah on its own, and therefore, even if the idol worshiper, the non-Jewish idol worshiper, is the one who nullifies the Avodah Zarah, we assume the Jew is still actually going by, and this goes back to the first reading we saw of him, that the Jew is actually doing it on his own or on her own. And it's not that they're just following the Gentile, and therefore, when the Gentile nullifies the Avodah Zarah, it's still going to be forbidden because of the part the Jew has in the idol. Okay, so that was three versions of this Rabbi Hillel and what it was said about. New Mishnah. Ketzad mevatla. How do we nullify an Avodah Zarah? And we've seen this before. We brought this up in a different sugya, on Daf Mem Daled. Kata rosh ozna, rosh chotma, rosh etzba'ah. Okay, if you took off a piece of it, okay, a bit of its, the tip of its ear, okay, the bit on its nose, the part of its finger. Pechasa, if you crush it, even though you didn't break anything. We're going to see in the Gemara, what does that mean? Right? How do you crush something without breaking it? Bitzla. All those cases, the idol is nullified. Because it shows, again, this is if the Gentile does it, not if a Jew does it. If a Jew does it, it doesn't work because a Jew's idol can never be nullified. But if a Gentile does it, that's what they have to do. They have to do something physical to change the idol. If the Gentile spits in the face of the idol, hishtim b'fanea, urinates before the idol, gerera, drags it in the dirt, throws feces on it, that is not considered nullified. Now, if you remember, we brought this up. What about the Aphrodite, where they urinate all the time on Aphrodite, if you remember, in the bathhouse, and they said that was nullified, and this is not, and what's the difference? And the Gemara there suggested that that's because this is just for a moment. The Gentile got angry and therefore did this, but it was a one-time. It wasn't like a continuous thing. That's one possibility. There's a few other possibilities about how to reconcile this. Some people say this is talking about when you're forced to do it, meaning someone put a gun to your head and said, or to the non-Jewish idol worshiper, and said, urinate on the idol. Then it's not enough. If they said, break the idol, well, breaking the idol, once the idol is broken, it is enough. Even if it was just ba'ones, that would be considered nullification. But urinating on it or one of the other things wouldn't. That's another possibility. And there's one other possibility, another way to distinguish that. There's probably more that the commentaries brought. It's an issue people struggle with. Some people say that Aphrodite was never intended to be built as an idol, and therefore it was built from the beginning for people to urinate right next to it in the bathhouse. So that's a different story because it was never built to be an idol, whereas this was built to be an idol, and it's harder to nullify it just by urinating. And that would mean that the action of urinating or whatever all those other actions were, spitting, dragging it, all those things are not enough to actually nullify an idol ever, if it really is an idol. The Aphrodite had never really been an idol, okay, because it could be, but this one was created for the purpose of being in the bathhouse and not to be worshipped. So anyway, there's a whole bunch of questions how to reconcile this. We're going to go back now to the Mishnah. Mishnah finishes with another case of trying to see is this nullified or not, and here we're going to have a machloket. Mechara or mishkena, if the Gentile idol worshiper sells it or gives it as collateral for a loan, Rabbi Yomi bitel, Chachamim omrim lo bitel. We're going to understand this machloka better when we get to the Gemara, but Rabbi says it's nullified, the rabbis say no. So now the Gemara goes back to the beginning of the Mishnah and the issue of pchasa, if you crush it, kilo chisra b'mai bitla. Well, if you crush something, you didn't actually, what they mean by crush is like to smush it, like you didn't really change anything. You didn't really break anything. So Amar Rabbi Zarah shepachasa b'faneha. What it means is you crushed it in the face, you smushed it. Now, think about like what I immediately thought of the nose. The nose just gets flat, right? You basically ruin the form of it, okay? Even though you didn't actually break a piece off. Rakat b'faneha v'ishtim b'faneha. Menane milei. Where do we get this from? Amar, that it's not enough. Amar chizkiah da amar kran. The pasuk says, okay, here we're quoting a pasuk in Yeshayahu. Yeshayahu is talking about the Jewish idol worshippers. It says, Vayaki yirav. When you start getting hungry and you decide you're going to leave, like this is just talking about any idol worshiper, besides they're hungry and they leave, he starts cursing the gods that he's been worshiping, like, what are you doing for me? And they turn to God. And after that it says, right, this is Yeshayahu describing the typical path of an idol worshiper. Things go bad, they decide to leave the idol, and then they turn to God. And then it says, and then they look at the land and they see it's dark and it's narrow and dark. Okay, so what exactly does this mean? Well, the drasha is going to be even though they turn to God, ultimately they're going to turn back to the land, meaning to the idol again. So what we're going to see here is that the reason this explains the way the Gemara explained it on Mem Dalet, this was a one-off. So they got angry at the idol, they left it, but then they went back to it. Okay, they urinated or dragged it on the floor, but through the dirt. But in the end, they're going to go back. Thus is the way of idol worshippers. You could call it fickle. Mechara or mishkena Rabbi Yomi bitel. So now we're going to have a big machloket about this because the area Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, Amar Rav. So the area in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba in the name of Rav. Chad Amar machloket b'tzoref ovei kochavim. The question is, who are they selling it to? That's really the question. So according to one opinion, we don't know who says what, Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, one said the machloket is specifically, now you have to be careful, it's bitzoref ovei kochavim, where the artisan is a Gentile. Now, what does it mean? The artisan, they're selling it to. So we have a Gentile who owns an idol. They're now selling it to a different Gentile. That's when the machloket is, was that nullified or not? Aval bitzoref Yisrael, devrei hakol bitel. But if they sell it to a Jew, it's obviously nullified because the Jew's obviously not planning to worship idols. So by the idol worshiper, non-Jewish idol worshiper, selling it to a Jew, that makes it nullified. The Chanamar, but so if Israel machloket. No, the machloket is if they're selling it to a Jew, are they planning to nullify it or not? But now the question is, what's the but? What about a Gentile, according to this? If you say the machloket is in Tzaref Yisrael, was it a reaction to the previous and saying, oh, you said they all agree with the Jew that it's nullified? And I think it's a machloket. But what about if they sell to a Gentile? Is it also a machloket? Or is it obvious there that what? If they sell to a Gentile, maybe it's obvious that they're not planning to nullify because they assume the idol worshiper is going to continue, is going to worship the idol. The non-Jewish person they're selling to, assumption is they're planning to continue it as an idol. So that's going to be the question right now. So according to the second reading, that the machloket is if you sell it to a Jew, is it nullified or not? If you say that, do we say, but tzoref Yisrael machloket, aval tzoref ovei kochavim divrei hakol lo bitel. But if you sell it to a Gentile, for sure you weren't the non-Jew wasn't nullifying it. O dilma bein bezeh ubein bezeh machloket. Or is the machloket across the board? Does it matter? Just by them selling it, does that mean I don't want this to be an idol anymore? Or maybe they're selling it and they're saying, I want it to be an idol, I'm just selling it to someone else. And maybe it doesn't matter whether they're selling to a Jew or Gentile. So we have these two opinions of Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. We don't know who says what, but one says clearly, I'll tell you what they agree about and I'll tell you what they disagree about, right? That was the first. They definitely agree. I'm just reviewing. They definitely agree for selling to a Jew that they're not planning on having it be an idol anymore. The machloket is when they sell to a Gentile. The second one says, no, even when, well, now the question is it even or is it when? When they sell to a Jew, that's the debate. Is that the only case of the debate or is it both? That's really the question. Is it even when they sell to a Jew, it's a machloket, or is it only when they sell to a Jew, it's a machloket? That's the question. So now we're going to say, Tashma, let's learn from here. Da'amar Rebbe, nir'im divarai k'shemachal lechabla, v'divrei chaverai k'shemachal avodah. There's a few things here that aren't clear. There's a few things that are clear. Rebbe says, it seems like I'm right if they sell it lechabla, which usually means to destroy. And it seems like my friends, meaning the person who disagrees with me, the rabbis, are right when he sells it to be worshipped. Now, what we don't know is what exactly does it mean lechavla and what is limachla. But what is clear to Rebbe is when he says it seems like I'm right in this case, and it seems like the rabbis are right in that case, what he's basically saying is even though we disagree in both cases, it seems like I'm right in this one, and the rabbis are right in that one. So there seems to be this assumption that they disagree in both because you wouldn't say it seems like I'm right here when the other side doesn't even disagree. And you wouldn't say it seems like they're right there if I didn't disagree. So that's what Rebbe is saying. So now the question is, what is my lechabla or my lavda? What does that mean? If the non-Jewish idol worshiper is selling it to be destroyed, okay, and lavda, and then it's nullified, and they're selling it to be worshipped, and that means right, lavda mamash. They're selling it to a person who wants to worship it. My time and demand amar bitel, my time and demand amar lo bitel. There can't possibly be a machloket in that case. In the case of he sold it to be worshipped, of course it's not going to be nullified. So it can't possibly be there's a machloket, and the person who said it's not nullified wouldn't be true. And the person who said it's nullified can't possibly be true. Of course it's not nullified. He sold it to someone to worship. And if the person sold it to someone to break, of course it's nullified. They're obviously canceling it. You can't possibly say it's not nullified. So it can't possibly be that machloket, and that's what they're talking. This source couldn't be talking about that because there's definitely no machloket. And again, the assumption was from the wording of Rebbe, you could see they clearly debate. Elalav lechabala. So what? Elalav lechabala. What is chabala mean? Lemisha atid lechabla. To someone, if you sell it to someone who will break, who is that? Manu tzaref Yisrael. You're selling it to someone who is likely going to break it, because if you knew they were going to break it, of course nobody thinks it's not nullified. Of course you're not the Gentile nullified. So if you sell it to, now what do you see here? If you sell it to a Jew, there's a machloket here. And l'avda, l'misha ati l'avda. If you're selling it to be worshipped, what does that mean? To someone who will potentially worship in the future. Umanu, and who's that? So refo ve'kochavim. Ushma mina, bein bezo machloket. From here, it seems like the two cases discussed here, the Rebbe says, oh, I think you'll agree with me in this case, and you agree with the other side in that case, which means they actually disagree in both cases, is clearly a machloket in both. Okay, and that's the way it seems to be. Now, this next line, there's a big debate about how to read it. There's a long Tosfot on this, which brings different girsa because it doesn't make any sense. But then in the middle of the Tosfot, he says, well, I'll give you a way to read according to the version of the text that appears by us, and we'll go with that interpretation. Then now what the Gemara is doing is once we read this Breita, and the Breita basically says, okay, I'll just sort of try to clarify for you what we did so far. We have two opinions, Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, we don't know who says what, about whether. Okay, the first person said the machloket is if you sell it to a Gentile, but if you sell it to a Jew, they all agree, which means it's not a machloket in both cases. That's the opinion we're going to go back to right now. Because let's stop, let's already say it. What we just proved from the Breita, okay, or maybe I'll go a little farther and then we'll go back. The other one said the machloket in the case of you selling the Gentile sells it to a Jew. But he doesn't say what the machloket, what the situation is if you sell to a Gentile. And we didn't know. Is there a machloket also? Or do they all agree that it's definitely not nullified? We brought this Breita that shows they clearly disagree in both cases because of the wording of Rebbe. So that supports the answer of the second reading, which is it seems to be a machloket in both cases. But if we now try to read this source that we just read, the Breita, with the first reading, with the first opinion, the first person's opinion, whether it's Rebbe or Rabbi Yochanan, we don't, Rav or Rabbi Yochanan, we don't know. But one of them said it's only a machloket in the case where he sells to a Gentile, but not when it's sold to a Jew. So now that opinion doesn't fit with this Breita because this Breita said they disagree in both cases. So how are we going to read the Breita according to the first reading? Okay, what we did in the previous section was we asked a question on the second reading, but now we're on the second opinion. Now we're going back to the first opinion and say, well, how would the first opinion read this Breita? So we had a question about the second opinion. We brought a Breita to bring the answer to the second opinion, okay, which means both cases they have a debate. But now we have to throw this Breita back on the first and say the first doesn't make sense. So how are we going to read it? So they say, lo, you don't have to read it the way we just read it. You could read it like this, Hachi Kamar. Amar Rebbe. Now, instead of saying that Rebbe said, it should be like me here and it should be like you there, even though we both disagree about in both cases. But he says like this, Amar Rebbe, Nir'im divarai lechaverai. My friends should agree with me, meaning you shouldn't even disagree with me about this, meaning the rabbis should agree with me, meaning maybe they even do, kishem achra lechabla, which is umanu, soref Yisrael. שאף חבריי לא נחלקו עליי, אלא כשמכרה לעבדה. אבל לחבלה מודו לי. Saying they should agree with me in what case? In a case where it's sold to a Jew, which is exactly what the first opinion said. That of course it's going to be nullified. And they should only disagree with me in the case of the Gentile. Is it nullified? Is it not nullified? So I agree that they could disagree with me about that. But l'chabla, for sure they would agree with me. And that's how the first reading is going to read this Breita. Now we have again another question. Well, now we're going to have a second question on the first opinion here. Metive. We're going to have a source that seems to contradict, right? Just like this Breita just seemed to contradict what we explained it. We're going to have the same thing with the next source. If you buy small coins from a Gentile, okay, lots of small coins mixed up, and it's like a bunch of little things. I think they're even like broken coins, maybe. So you have these grutaot. And then you find among them idols. Okay, so you get like a pile of junk kind of thing. And in there are idols mixed in. Now, if you remember, when we learned about kinyanim, generally giving the money is not what acquires it. It's usually mashicha. But with a Gentile, it's giving the money. So if you didn't give the money, but you pulled the grutaot into your property, yachzil, you actually you can return them because now there's Avodah Zarah. You could say, I never meant to buy them. And since the sale wasn't final anyway yet, because you hadn't given the money, you can give them back. But and you should give them back. But if you already gave the money, then you took the grutaot into your property. There's nothing you could do. They're yours or they're Avodah Zarah. And yeah, there are Jews Avodah Zarah. You'll have to give them, throw them into the Dead Sea. Now, now, remember, this is a case of an idol worshiper, non-Jewish idol worshiper selling to a Jew. Now, if you say, B'tzoref Yisrael machloket, that that is a case of a machloket. That was the second opinion. Hamani Rabbanan. Then it would be very simple. This is Rabbanan that it's not batel. But but the first opinion said, everyone agrees if the Gentile tells it to a Jew, it's going to be nullified. So Hamani, this is going to match nobody's opinion because everyone agrees it's nullified. If it's nullified, you don't have to throw it into the Dead Sea. To which the answer, Shanehatam da'adate de gruta ot zabin. Adate dover avodah zarah lo zabin. What does it mean here? How does this whole thing work? When the non-Jewish idol worshiper sells their idol to the Jew, what they're meant to say is, I'm selling you this idol. I don't want it to be an idol anymore. I know you're a Jew. I know you're not going to worship it. And with that, it's nullified, or possibly, depending on the opinion. But if you sell it if you give it in a pile of other things that you never even intended, you didn't even know there were idols in there, and you sold it to the Jew, there was no active act of nullifying it, and that's why it's still going to remain with its original status, and that doesn't raise a question on the opinion that we were talking about. Now we're going to move on to a Braita. Now we're going to give a bunch of cases, and then the Gemara is going to say, why do you need to mention all these cases? Lava aleha. Someone took out a loan, so they gave this item as collateral. Again, that was in the Mishnah. We didn't really talk about the case, but the Mishnah said either they sold it or they gave it as collateral. That's the machloket Rebbe and the rabbis, whether it's batel. Osha nafla alav mapolet. So again, we don't have the halacha here yet, but if someone loaned money on this, meaning gave it as collateral, or mapolet fell upon it, okay, a house collapsed and it was under the rubble and they didn't take the idol out, or it was stolen by bandits, where they left it and went abroad and just left their idols behind. Okay, turning now to Amud Bet. If the people are planning to come back for it, like in the time of Yoshua, we're going to ask later why they add these words, because you could have said it without these words, but like the Gentiles who left Israel in the time of the war, the battles with Yoshua, where they left with the intent to come back, like they were chased away, but they were hoping to come back to their land. Eina betila. These items are not nullified. They left them behind, but they're hoping to come back. Why do we need all these cases? Right now, and usually for collateral, you're planning to get it back. It makes sense. It's not canceled. Midelo zavna lo batla. So there it makes a lot of sense. You didn't sell it, and therefore it's not nullified. Aval nafla aleha mapolet. But if rubble falls upon it, and midelo kamifanela, the fact that you didn't, it's a collateral, I didn't have a way to get it back really. But this I could have, the Gentile could have moved the rubble away and taken the idol out of there. So they didn't do that. You might have thought maybe they really did nullify it. Sricha. That's why they need to tell you no. And if you say, well, rubble fell upon it and they're going to come back for it still, mishum de savar hamancha. Well, there you could say, okay, why did you undo the rubble? Well, because you were planning to come back for it later. You know it's there. You know no one's getting to it, and you know it's there. And eventually one day when you really want it, you'll go get it. And that's why it's not nullified. Kol ema to be right? Because again, mishum de savar hamancha. You said, well, it's there, and kol ema to be and anytime I want, shakilna. Okay, so again, we're talking about a Gentile who this happens to the idol. We're assuming it's not nullified because they know at any given point they could come back to it. Aval gamvuelistin, but if somebody stole it, no, we always hold up hope we'll get it back. But theoretically, you could say, look, it's not my property anymore. Midelo kamahadra abatra, because they're not running after them to try to find. Maybe they nullified it. Sricha. That's why you needed that case to just say no. There was no real act of nullification there either. The itana gambua listim. By the way, this is a little different from a thief. A thief you don't know, but the listim at least you recognize. You can maybe hope to find them. Itana gambua listim mishum desaval iove kochavim shakela mifrach palachla. Now we're going to see another reason why. If bandits stole it, well, they're going to say either the bandits were non-Jewish bandits and they'll worship it. In other words, why would I nullify my idol if I'm an idol worshiper? Why would I nullify it if I know it's just probably in the hands of another idol worshiper? And Israel shakla, what if a Jew took it from me? Well, I'll assume that what I did to them, look, it's worth a lot. Right? Most robbers actually sell what they steal. So likely they'll sell it for money, and they'll sell it to who? To a Gentile. So the person who's robbed from, even if they don't think they're going to get it back, so maybe the distinction I made between the Ganav and the Gazlan is really irrelevant. Even if they don't think they're going to get it back, they figure someone else will worship it down the road. And that's why it's not nullified. Now we finally get to the fourth case. If you leave it behind and go abroad, they didn't take it with them. Obviously, they don't really plan to come back for it. No tzricha. If they're planning to come back, we're assuming they're planning to come back, and it's not nullified. So now they say, first of all, wait a minute. The people who ran away in the time of Yoshua from the war, the 7 nations, whoever got away, they weren't planning to come back. Well, hachi kamar. Im atidim lachzor, harei k'mechem Yoshua ve'en la betela. So they say, what it really means to say is not that they actually came back, but if you're hoping, atidim lachzor means you're hoping. They were hopeful they would come back to the land. So if that's the case, then it's not nullified. But now they ask the more important question, which is, why do they need to add those words? They could have just said, what do we gain by adding the words, like in the time of Yoshua? So now they said, we want to teach you milta agav orche kamashman. They wanted to teach you something by the way, which is what? Ki hada amar Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav Yisrael shezakaf levena lishtachavot la. I'm going to teach you this outside for a minute. The central idea they're going to say is they wanted you to know that laws of nullifying idols are like they were when Yoshua came into the land and there was nullification of idols. That's the basic. The reason why they made this comparison here is to say we're going to learn from Yoshua. So now what are we learning? Well, Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav that if a Jew takes a brick, we saw this before, and stands it up to worship it, and a Gentile comes and actually bows down to it, because it's not forbidden until the Jew bows down. But if the Gentile bows down, again, there's a machloket about that, assuming we're on the stage that just by building it, it's just by putting it there is not. Okay, this whole issue there, I'm not going to get into it, but we discussed already. But the Gentile comes and bows down to it, asara. The Gentile forbids it, even though it's not the Gentiles. Now, remember, what did we say? If the Gentile can't forbid something that's not their own, but because the Jew already stood it up, the Jew showed, I want this to be an idol, and the Gentile continued that, and it became an idol. And that's what we're going to explain now, but in a bit of a more long-winded way. Minalan da asara, how do we know it's forbidden? So Amar Rabbi Elazar, kitchilata shel Eretz Israel. It's like the beginning of Israel when we conquered the land. To Amar Rachmana, ashrehen tisrafum be'esh. Burn their Asherah trees, God said. Now, michte Yerusha ilahem avotechem, since we know that it was inheritance, right? God says this is inheritance from your forefathers. That means the land was originally owned by Abraham. Ve'en adam oser davar she'eno shelo. Now, all the Asherah trees that are in the land that were originally owned by Abraham, so they're not actually owned by the Gentiles. They were always ours. So how do the Gentiles have the right to make our idols, idols? They're not theirs to make forbidden. And therefore, if they're not forbidden to benefit from, why do we have to burn them? Now, if you say, well, there were people before Abraham, and they worshiped the idols, and maybe that's why they weren't Avram's to begin with. They were other people's to begin with, and therefore they could. But then we wouldn't need to burn them. Why? We would just find a local Gentile who could nullify them and say, oh, we don't worship that anymore, and then we wouldn't have to burn the trees. So what do they say? And here we're going to start having a comparison to the Jew who picks up the brick. Since the Jews worship the Egel HaZahav, the golden calf, Galu Adatayu, they showed that they liked Avodah Zarah. And when the Gentiles came, they were basically worshiping these Asherah trees. They were doing what the Jews wanted with their own trees. Just like the Jew stands up the brick, but didn't worship it yet. When the Gentile worships it, it becomes forbidden, right? It becomes forbidden to benefit from. So likewise, when the Jews owned the land, the Jews showed that they want to worship idols because of the Chet Egel. And therefore, when the Gentiles came into the land and worshiped the trees, it was the trees that the Jews anyway wanted to be worshiping. So they're just doing what the Jews wanted, and since it belongs to the Jews, and it belonged to the Jews presumably, right? What this is claiming is even when they left the land, it was still under the ownership of the Jews. So basically, that's why it would work, and that's just same thing. Same thing with the Jew who picks up this brick, stands it up to worship. Shows persons interested in worshiping idols. Okay, and they show that the Gentile is just doing what the Jew wanted, and that's why it's going to become forbidden. And it's a little bit hard to say this, but that's the Milta Agav Orcha that we learn by saying it's Kimachemet Yoshua. It's like when the Jews came into the land, also for this other issue. So now the Gemara has a few questions, which is Dilma be'egel hu denichale b'midi achrina lo. Just because they worship the golden calf, maybe they wanted to worship the golden calf. Who's to say they wanted to worship the Asherah trees? Amar Kra Ela Elohecha Yisrael. Now the pasuk says here, these are your gods in plural. Ela Elohecha Yisrael. That's what they said at the Cheda Ega. Milamed she'ivu le'elohot harbeh. It looks like they worshipped a lot of gods. But wait, another question. Maybe then only things that were around at the time of Cheda Egel, trees from then. But what about trees that later the Gentiles worshiped? Maybe the Jews didn't want to worship those things, and maybe they weren't okay with it when the Gentiles did, and the Gentiles wouldn't be able to forbid it. To which they say, Ma muchach, okay? And what they're basically saying is, right, or could be also trees that came later, right, that were planted later. So the Gemara says, "Mamuchach," like, go prove it. How are you going to prove which trees were planted when to know what was around at the time of the Jews that they wanted to be idols and what came later that they had no connection to and wasn't things that they wanted to be idols and be forbidden? We have no way to know that, and that's why all the Asherah trees had to be burned. And that's just a whole aside we got to because of the words Melchemet Shua. Now we get to the next mission. Avodah Zarah shenichua avdeha b'shat shalom muteret b'shat milchama asura. If people left an Avodah Zarah, if they left it in a time of peace, it's permitted. If they left it in a time of war, it's forbidden. The assumption here is, and Rashi even adds something which raises a whole bunch of questions, but to ein datam lachzor, we're assuming they left it without intending to come back. Now, if they left it without intending to come back in peace, we assume they're not really intending to come back, and it's permitted. But if they left it, and this is a Gentile, if they left it in a time of war and said, we're running away and maybe never coming back, they didn't really know it, right? They thought about it in a minute like that because they had no choice. But obviously, if you would ask them and they were thinking clearly, they say, yeah, I'd love to come back. And they left their idols behind, so those idols we assume are still idols. The kings, okay, we're going to learn about this in a minute. These are permitted because they only put them up when the kings pass by. What does this mean? When the king would pass by a place, they would put up idols on these little stands, and then the king would bow down to the idol as the king was passing through a certain area. So there are these kind of temporary stands for idols. So they're permitted. Let's see in the Gemara why this is. So Amar B'Yirmiyah Bar Abba Amarav, Beit Nimrod. This is where the Migdal Bavel was, the tower they tried to build to the heavens. It's like Avodah Zarah that was left in a time of peace, and it's permitted because nobody worships it anymore, and they left it behind. Even though when God scattered them all, it was like a war, right? It was God scattered everybody, and they couldn't speak and communicate with each other, and everyone just ran away. Well, but it's been around for years, and if they wanted to come back to it, they could have, and they didn't. So midelo hadar bitule bata. The fact that they haven't come back shows, even though they left it like a time of war, but they didn't come back to it in a time of peace, and that means nobody really wants it to be an idol anymore. So now they ask, doesn't make any sense. If they put them up and they put idols on them when the kings go by, shouldn't it be forbidden? So Rabbi Bar Chana says in the name Rabbi Yochanan, this is how you should read it. Nowadays, when the king comes through or a president comes through, everybody knows the path the president's going to take, although there are some times where they trick people up. They don't want people to know they're going this way. They go a different way. But usually everybody knows, and it's all path, there's a whole path. In those days, the king, there wasn't so much communication. They knew the king was coming through. They set up idols seemingly in a bunch of places. Will the king take this path? Will the king take this path? So the fact that there's a platform that they set up for an idol to be worshipped doesn't necessarily mean that it was actually used, because the king may have chosen to take a different path. Okay, we're going to end with the story of Ula. When Ula came to Eretz Israel, when he came to Babylonia, he sat on a platform that a king could, one of these platforms that we were talking about. Amalei Rabbi Yehuda leUla. Rabbi Yehuda says to Ula, Vaha Rabbi Shmuel. Okay, now this is a real Eretz Israel story because Ula is coming from Israel. He gets to Babylonia. He does something that the Babylonians look at and say, "What are you doing? All our rabbis forbid this." Ha Rabbi Shmuel the Amrit Ravayu bimus shenifgam asul. Okay, he was sitting. I forgot to mention it was a bimusa puguma. It was broken. Okay, and he sits on this broken platform and comes Rav Yehuda and he says, but my two rabbis and the two biggest rabbis in Babylonia both forbid sitting on a broken platform. Just because it's broken doesn't mean they won't use it, right? If an idol's broken, that's one thing. The platform, not such a big deal. And even if you say nobody worships broken pieces of idols, remember this big machloket, do you not? That's because the idol itself, it's embarrassing to, right? It's broken. But here, well, what do they care? The platform has a little nick in it. Okay. Amarle. So now comes Ula, the outsider, and he comes and he says, listen, if I only had the dust from their grave, I would fill my eyes with it, and it would make me see better, meaning I have all respect for Rav and Shmuel. However, okay, it's like saying with all due respect. Afilu lamanda amar uvdim l'shvarim. I'm sorry, I skipped a line. Ha, Rabbi Yochanan v'Rish Lakish, but my two big rabbis, Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, to Amrei Travayu, they both say bimus shenifga muta. They say no, a bimus, if it gets broken, any sort of problem with it, totally permitted. V'afilu lamanda amar, and they say the complete opposite. Even for the one who holds uvdim l'shvarim, people still worship broken idols. But that's the idol itself. Since it was a worshipped item, people are going to still worship even the broken pieces of it because they have such respect for it, deference for it. But avalhane, shakalahai, might be musachrina, but it's just a silly platform. They'll just throw out the platform, and it didn't have any, Avodah Zarah sanctity to it. It didn't have any significance to it. And Tani Kavateda Rabbi Yochanan Barish Lakish, here's a bright to support their reading. Bimus shenifgam mutal, mizbech shenifgam asul ad shinatetz rubo. If it's a platform, it's permitted if it's broken. If it was an altar that was used to offer to the idols, then it's not. It can't be used until the majority of it is broken. Now, if you come and you see this kind of thing, how do you know the difference? Because a bimus platform and a mizbech might look kind of similar. Amar Rabbi Yaakov Reidi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, bimus even echad, mizbech avanim harbeh. A bimus is made of one big stone carved out into a platform or just there, and a mizbeach is made of a lot of different stones built up on to the size of this platform, and that's how you know the difference between the two. Okay, that ends our daf. We started off with three different opinions of this, three different readings of this line of Rabbi Hillel. Said that actually it's talking about a case of partnership and what the case of partnership he was referring to and what the issue was. From there, we went to how do you nullify, how does a Gentile nullify Avodah Zarah? What counts as nullification? What doesn't count as nullification? We compared it to the sugya with Aphrodite, how the urinating actually made it disqualified. Here it doesn't, what the differences are. The Gemara didn't talk about that, but we talked about it. Then we had what's the pachasa, right? Smushing it. It has to change its form, otherwise it's not really going to make a difference, even though it's not broken. And then we had how do we get why, right? Why is this issue of defacing, doing some disrespectful act like spitting, urinating is not canceling it, and that's because the person is just doing it temporarily, they're angry. From there, we got to the selling of it, and this machloka between Rebbe and the rabbis about selling or giving it as collateral. Is it to a Jew? Is it to a Gentile? Which case did they disagree about? Do they agree about the other case that they don't disagree about? One was clear, one wasn't clear. We had two different opinions here. It's interesting. There we also have Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, which, by the way, we ended with Rav and Rabbi Yochanan with different approaches. And then we went to these four cases where it's not going to be nullified because people are planning to come back. We said, what do you need all four cases for? Why do you need to say if they're planning to come back like Milchama Yoshua? And we ended up saying we learned some other halacha that's similar to nullification in the time of Yoshua. And then we got to the Avodah Zarah, that if you leave it behind, depending time of peace, time of war, how did you leave it? Is it nullified or not? And then we got from there to the platforms that they used for the kings. From there, we distinguished between that and an altar. Different things on that. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day and a Shavua Tov.